Hi, my name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here at Kings Harbor, and thank you so much for utilizing this resource. Our hope for you in anything that we provide is that you would expect transformation, that we could demonstrate love towards you because of the love of God demonstrated to us, that you would have the faith stirred in you to deal with obstacles and to see opportunities, and that ultimately that the kingdom of God would be revealed in every area of your life. And so our hope with this resource is that the Lord would speak to you powerfully.
If you got a Bible, go to Mark chapter 5. I'm just going to move quick this morning. And so good to see you. If you're a guest, I'm grateful that you're with us. There's a couple of things. Let's just name some elephants in the room. I am wearing a jacket and dress shoes because I'm going to talk about demons this morning. You can't come up here in your Fraggle Rock shirt. Fraggle Rock was this cartoon back in the 80s about these creatures that were in the wall, and they were very musical. Just don't want anybody to feel unincluded this morning. And then if you're familiar with your Bible and you're familiar with Mark chapter 5, we're going to be talking about a text that has demons in it. And that's not your typical Sunday morning. In fact, some of you are like, if I had known it was this Sunday morning, I would have gone to church on the beach and been part of their launch this morning. I promise you nothing. That's what I promise you. And so before we jump in, let me talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. And so a couple of weeks ago, we started a series called Responding Courageously. And we started looking at what does it mean to have the courage in our moment and our context to respond to the brokenness of our day. That if our call is to be the gospel-centered leaders that are stepping into grace deserts to bring kingdom flourishing, if the call of the kingdom is that we go from this chaos to bringing this level of fulfillment and order, if that's what the people of God do, then what does it look like to have the courage to do that? And in particular, we've been talking specifically about a ministry that was born out of one of the leaders in our church, Harbor Rock Recovery, and Dan Bradford. And as he begins to get ready to launch full-time into that at the end of this year, even what does that look like for us, a church, to be around, support, and think rightly about what's going on? So with that in mind, if you're not familiar with Harbor Rock, what Harbor Rock does is it brings recovery resources. It exists to bring recovery resources to those that are battling addiction, substance abuse, things of that nature. And so as I say that, and you know that the heart of the series is geared towards helping our eyes see that well, I probably need to make some disclaimers with this text, lest you think that the way that we're assuming those that are walking in that state are living. And so let me give you two disclaimers. Here's the first one. There's a danger when we reduce the human experience to either primarily physical or spiritual. Souls and bodies are deeply intertwined and more complex than we'd like to admit. Now, the reason I say that is because if you only see the world as primarily physical, then having any supernatural environment with this physical ailment feels like we're being unkind, unreasonable, or just archaic. Like, man, why are you thinking like you're back in the BC era? Like, we got science, bro. But I think the opposite can be dangerously true also. So there was a day and age where there was this kind of dualism of between the spiritual and the physical, and everything below the line of the spiritual was just kind of this container holding the soul until the Lord came and got you. And the reality is that we're much more complex than that both of those things are true. And so when we lean into a text and we begin to have a conversation about maybe some supernatural, some non-physical elements that impact the way that we live, that actually shouldn't be strange to you. In fact, if I said that about your physicality, if I said, hey, like there's something going on with your gastrointestinal system and maybe there's some kind of spiritual attack that's a part of it, you probably wouldn't freak out if I said that. But if we said, hey, you're dealing with some emotional and maybe even mental issues, and we somehow link that to maybe some level of spiritual attack, but somehow we've separated those two things and said, well, it's not right for you to say that. You're disregarding what somebody might be going through. My point is just that we're complex enough that those things affect one another. And that's not just the Bible that would say that, like science in our day and age says that. That's why there's books like Your Body Keeps Score, because there's emotional trauma that affects your physicality, that there is a reality that the spiritual and the physical are intermingled in such a way that we cannot separate them and then come up with a simple solution for one, not addressing the other. Here's my second disclaimer. Biblical narratives describe and display. While the details may not match exactly, they give us an opportunity to see the Lord and ourselves better. So this text will not be a one-for-one. As we read through this text and read what's going on, it is not a recipe for if you happen to run into somebody who's demonized, how you should deal with it. Nor is it us saying that when you look at the situations that we're talking about, that they're the exact same as these, but the power of the Lord that's displayed and the response of the people is informative and formative for us. So with that in mind, here's our main idea. Complex challenges require an intensified dependence on the power and the presence of Jesus. And so what we'll do, we're just going to walk through the first 20 verses of Mark chapter 5, and in verses 1 through 5, we're going to look at a hopeless outlook. In verses 6 through 13, we're going to just admit that this just got weird. And then in 14 through 20, we'll just talk about some very real fears. Let me pray, and then we'll enter in. And so Jesus, with texts like these, the sensational nature of thinking about demonization can distract us from what you really want to help us to see. One, I've already said it today, but I'll say it again, that in the scene when the man who's demonized comes to you, this is not some epic struggle that would be in some kind of anime. It's him bowing down, the demon pleading, seeing your power. Would we not miss that just because we're encountering something textually that's not normative to what we experience day to day? And more than that, would you take what it meant for those in that day to hear and see that, and would you apply it closely to our hearts, closely to our context, closely to our cultural moment, that we might respond faithfully because of what we see about you and what we learn about ourselves? Would you give us that grace this morning? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Mark chapter 5, starting verse 1 would say this. They, being Jesus and the disciples, came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as he got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. He lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out, cutting himself with stones. As we enter into this, this obviously is 5 chapters into the book of Mark. It's not the first narrative in Mark. It's not the first story, or even, it's not even actually the first time that there's a moment when somebody who is demonized gets delivered by Jesus. Like there's things that have happened before this. And in particular, what just happened before this is that Jesus was with his disciples on a boat in the middle of a storm. He's taking a nap, like all good leaders do. And as the storm's raging, they're like, do you not even care about us? Are we going to die? It says that they're terrified. And Jesus wakes up, calms the storm. And then they're more terrified afterwards, like, I didn't know my boss had it like that. You can tell waves to stop? You can stop storms? All right, Jesus. So when they get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, he gets out, and this man comes to him. And honestly, nothing happens here at this point. These first five verses, there's not real progress in the story. There's no conversation, there's no interaction. We just know that Jesus is standing on the side of the bank of the Sea of Galilee, on the east side, and this man comes running to him, and then Mark spends a whole lot of ink describing the situation to us. Why is that? Because when you read the level of description that he goes into about this man with an unclean spirit, it's interesting because it feels like he's trying to make us feel the weight and the magnitude of the problem. So the first thing that he says is that this man has an unclean spirit and he exists amongst the tombs. In that day and age, in a Jewish culture, now we're actually outside of the Jewish culture. We're in an area called the Decapolis, which is a Gentile region. From what we know, it's the first time that Jesus has been there. But as we get into the Decapolis, in that day and age, to hang out amongst the dead would have made you questionable, certainly unclean. In fact, I don't think it was just back then. I think that's right now. If you're sitting next to somebody and you're like, hey man, what'd you do last night? I watched Florida State go 0-3. What'd you do last night? Man, I was hanging out at the tombs. Tell me you're not gonna move 3 seats down. Because we're just like, we don't do that. Like, that's not where you spend time. Like, even though we are a little bit more modern and we understand death a little bit better, we're still not comfortable there. And so in that day and age, though, it wasn't just that it was taboo culturally or just that it was awkward. It was that it would make you unclean to be near a dead body. And so the picture that he's starting to paint is that this man is both unclean on the outside and on the inside. And not only is this man unclean on the outside and on the inside, but he starts giving you this language about that nobody could restrain him, that they put chains on him, that they put shackles on him, but he would rip the chains, that he would smash the shackles. And it says again that no one had the strength to restrain him. And so now not only is he unclean, but he's uncontainable. And then not only is he unclean and not only is he uncontainable, but it says that day and night that he's cutting himself and crying out in the midst of these tombs. And so now you've got a man who's unclean, both internally and externally, a man who is uncontainable and a man who is inconsolable because of how desperate his situation is. And can't nobody help him. Nobody's like, I got this. I was reading a Dr. Phil book the other day. Mark is trying to make it immensely clear for us. This is a difficult situation. I wrote it this way. There are moments when our best solutions don't match the size of the problem. Like nobody was like, I got this figured out. Let me in the tombs. I'm gonna talk to this dude. Nobody was signing up for that assignment. They tried the best of what they knew. They tried putting him in chains so he wouldn't either harm himself or other people. And there he was in the midst of the tombs with no chains on him, harming himself. And Jesus steps on the shore, and this guy comes straight up to him. And we pick it up in verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him. And he cried out with a loud voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you before God, don't torment me." For he had told him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." "What is your name?" he asked him. "My name is Legion," he answered, "because we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the region, or send them out of the region. A large herd of pigs was there, feeding on the hillside. The demons begged him, "Send us to the pigs so that we may enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. The herd of about 2,000 rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned there. So I titled this section, "This Just Got Weird for a Reason." But I want to go under the surface of something that feels like, and this will never end up in a children's coloring book, to thinking through the reality of some of what's happening at this moment. So Jesus is standing there, and this man comes running and kneels down before him, and the demon begins to cry out, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God." Now, I mentioned to you, there's a lot that's happened in Mark before this moment. And one of the interesting things is if the very first line of Mark is that he would say that he would start by calling. Mark don't got time for a lot of stuff. Mark don't got time for a manger. He don't got time for a birth narrative. There ain't no stars, like none of that. He jumps straight into Jesus was doing stuff. In fact, you read Mark chapter 1, your heart rate goes up a little bit because it's always like immediately, suddenly. But he just says, hey, I'm not going to even wait till the end to help you figure it out. I'm just going to tell you right away. Jesus, the Son of God. Like his whole point is that he's trying to make clear for you, this is who Jesus is. And then in fact, what keeps happening throughout the book is that people keep asking this question, who is this? What is he doing? Who's giving him this type of authority? Like, who is this? And we see this demon, and it's not the first time, because even back in Mark chapter 1, there's a demon that would say, "You, the Holy One of God." There's another instance where he's called out by a demon that says, "Hey, we recognize who you are." And then you get into this moment, and this demon seems to put it all together, that you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. And so like he understands spiritually who is standing in front of him. Now, I don't want to move past that too quickly, because the very first sermon that I ever preached here was out of Acts chapter 16. And there's a story of a young woman who's demonized, and Paul and Silas come near to her, and she says that you are ones that serve the Most High God. And I said it to you then, and I'll just say it again now, that you can get all the lyrics right and have the wrong melody. And so the demon was saying the right things. The demon had got the man in the right posture. But just because you're bowed down, because you recognize the authority of Jesus, doesn't mean that you're submitted in your life to Jesus. And so now a conversation ensues that Jesus says, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." And the spirit's like, "Hey man, don't torment me. I don't know how long this has been going on, but the one who's been tormenting someone else is all of a sudden a little bit scared of torment. And I don't know what torment means. I don't know if torment is, hey, don't bring now the ultimate judgment that I'm going to receive when you finish all things, or if it just means, hey, don't send me out of this area. But there's something about, I recognize that you have the power, the authority, and the right to adjudicate this situation. You can make a decision. I can't do anything about it, but I just want to plead on your mercy. And so he says to him, what's your name? Now, I don't care how many times you've done watch The Exorcist. If you are ever in this situation, don't be like, well, Pastor Mike said in Mark chapter 5, you ask what's your name. I did not tell you that. Mark is being descriptive, not prescriptive. He's telling you what happened. He's not saying, hey, go find a demon and start getting like, what's your name? What's your email? He's not doing that. In fact, I think the only reason that Mark highlights this moment is to help you understand the magnitude of what's going on in this man. It's not one demon, it's multiple demons. In that day and age, part of the Roman army was a legion, and there could be as many as 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers inside of a legion. And so there are thousands of demons at work in this guy. The level of ravaging that's going on in his soul is a level that most of us can't even imagine. And this conversation is not giving you a recipe for how to do this. It's helping to expose how deep the problem was. And it's interesting that the thing that they were concerned about was, don't send me out of this region. That language will be important to highlight that, circle that, because in a moment it's going to come up again in our text. But I just think it's interesting that they're like, hey, you could do what you want to do with us, but just don't make us leave this place. Like, we're afraid of leaving what's familiar to us, what we know. Author Michael Heiser would often talk about that there are spirits that have authority over a region or dwell in a region. That may be what's going on here. I don't know, but I think it's more important, the parallel that Mark will give us in just a moment. So they say, send us into those pigs so that we may enter them. And so he gave them permission. And 2,000 pigs go running off a cliff, fall into the water, and drown. I'm not one of those people that can walk in a room and be like, oh, there's about 312 and a half people in this room. I can't estimate numbers like that. So I can't fathom in my mind what a herd of 2,000 pigs looks like. I can't fathom in my mind what it would look like to see 2,000 pigs drowning at the same time. But I'm gonna tell you that it was probably pretty gnarly and chaotic. The squealing, the shrieking, the flailing, the thrashing, like, it had to be awkward. Like, can you just imagine? Because here's where this narrative is going to go. Ultimately, Jesus has set this man free. The people aren't comfortable with Jesus being there. And so Jesus and the disciples get back in the boat and they go back across the Sea of Galilee. Can you imagine what that boat ride was like? Like, you got to imagine there was some point halfway across that Peter was like, can we talk about, and John was like, nah, bro, just leave it alone. Just shut it down. Like this, we don't have a category for this. Some people would ask the questions of moral implications. Like, somebody owned this herd of pigs and they lost their economy with these pigs. Like, somebody would be like, I don't feel comfortable. Like, Jesus just killed all these animals. And I just want to pause. When it comes to redemption, it is always complex, always costly, and always chaotic. Like, what's happening here is this really complex situation about the supernatural and the natural going on in this guy and Jesus showing up. And there's this conversation going on about the region and what's going on in the region and being sent into pigs. And whoever owned that pigs, whatever it cost to have 2,000 pigs, that person lost that economic value in those pigs. And this had to be this chaotic scene of pigs thrashing and squealing and screaming. Like, it had to be awful to experience. And yet none of that makes that this guy got free any less beautiful than what it is. Like, Mark's point is not, man, we should probably call Peter because Jesus is like taking pigs out by the thousands. Mark's point is, this cost something. And it was chaotic, but it was worth it because look at this guy. We'll see in a few verses that when the people from the town show up, that he's sitting there with his clothes on in his right mind, just chilling. Like somebody who's been bound up the way that this guy's been bound up, somebody who's going through the damage that he's been going through, having thousands of demons on the inside of him, and in an instant, the power of God sets him free. That may change some things. That might disturb some stuff. That might cost something, and it's worth it, and it's beautiful because this person got free. Verse 14 would tell us, the men who tended them ran off and reported it to the town and the countryside. And people went to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. Then they began to beg him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. Jesus did not let him, but told him, "Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So he went and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. And so you can imagine if people are just randomly standing by, can kind of overhear in earshot this conversation of Jesus and this demon-possessed man, and all of a sudden 2,000 pigs go running off a cliff and squealing to their death in the middle of this body of water. That's the type of things to be like, all right, lunch break, we gotta go tell everybody. So they go into town and tell the people, and the people come running. And we saw a similar situation a couple of weeks ago when we talked about this woman at the well, and after she encountered Jesus, that she goes into town and goes running and tells them, and they all come running to see what she heard. And what happens there is that Jesus stays with them and begins to work amongst them, and they begin to believe. And they say, now we believe not just because of what she told us, but we believe because of what you're saying to us. And that's what you would expect in this text. Like, man, this guy, I just got to imagine if this guy day and night is screaming in agony. If this guy day and night, they're trying to contain him and he can't be contained. If this guy's known that, hey, when you walk by the tombs, just remember that dude, I was going to name a name, but if you're, I was going to be like, if Larry, but I'm like, if your name's Larry, I'm not talking about you, it ain't personal. If this dude, everybody's got to be like, hey, watch out for him because he's unclean and he's uncontainable, and he's inconsolable. Like, don't mess around and go anywhere near the tombs. You got to imagine that all the people who knew of this and were frustrated by it and afraid of it, you got to imagine that they want to come and see this. And when they come running and see that this guy's dressed and in his right mind, like, and sitting down, like able to contain himself, like that's got to be a powerful moment. And it says that their response to it in that moment was that they were terrified. Let me walk you back to Mark chapter 4, because there is this moment when the problem that they had, that they were saying to Jesus, will you do something about our problem? Why are you taking a nap and resting like this thing is okay? And when Jesus gets up and takes care of the problem, they're terrified. That there is this moment when the power of God moves in a way that you're not ready for, when it doesn't fit your box and your category, that it ought to scare you a little bit. When I lived in Dallas, there was this weird period. It was 2011. The Mavericks had just won the championship. I'm still bitter about it because they swept the Lakers in the conference semifinals. And because Dirk was like a cult hero, Dirk Nowitzki. And there were these T-shirts going around that said, "Dirk is my homeboy." And at the parade, all these people were wearing "Dirk is my homeboy" shirts. In 2011, at the same period of time, there was also this weird Christian subculture thing that had T-shirts that said, "Jesus is your homeboy." Here's the reality. I know where Dirk Nowitzki lives. But if I put on my Dirk is my homeboy shirt, I don't have one because I'm mad because he beat Kobe. Walked up to his front door, rang the doorbell. I'm like, "Dirk, let me in." I don't think I would get "let me" out of my mouth before security grabbed me and removed me from his property. Because just because I say that Dirk is my homeboy doesn't mean we actually have a relationship. In fact, the magnitude of his celebrity, the importance of who he is to the city, like that protects him from people who don't have a relationship with him feeling like they can just trespass on his property and his person. I would dare say in the same way, you can wear all the "Jesus is my homeboy" T-shirts that you want. But to actually not have a relationship with him, when you get in proximity of his power, what's actually going to do is it's going to terrify you, not invite you. Because if you don't actually love and respect who he is, you're going to see a power show, but you're not going to know the person who's behind the power. And so when they see Jesus' power, they're terrified. And they say to him, we need you to leave our region. This man, for I don't know how long, has been possessed by multiple thousands of demons who are familiar to the region enough that nobody is crying out, you got rid of them, they left our region, but they're saying, but we don't want you to stay. Like the strange parallel that these demons would feel comfortable to stay in this place, and these people would ask Jesus to leave this place. And so he does. He gets on the boat to leave. And the man runs to him and he begs Jesus to remain with him. Now, if you know anything about your Bible, right, like that's the goal, be with Jesus. Like that's the goal, to know Jesus. But there seems to be these moments when God shows an immense power that somebody has seen that he doesn't allow them to go with them, but he asks them to stay. Like that happens here in this picture with this man, that he comes running to Jesus and says, I want to go with you. And can you imagine the fear that would be embedded for him? Like, how do I operate in this society? They've known me as that guy. And now that I'm not that guy anymore, how are they going to treat me? Are they still going to be suspicious of me? Are they going to treat me like, well, maybe this is going to come back, so they're going to keep me at an arm's length? Like, you got to imagine how afraid and how real his fear must have been. And yet Jesus says, I need you to stay. It's not the only situation where that happens. There's a very clear picture in the book of John. In fact, I think it's John chapter 20. If you don't know much about the book of John, John chapter 20 is the resurrection chapter. And Mary goes to the tomb and she bumps into Jesus. She realizes that it's Jesus, and her impulse is, you're alive, let me hug you. And he's like, no, don't stay with me. Go tell the brothers. That there's something in Jesus that says, hey, you who've experienced my power, that you have an opportunity and a responsibility to partner with me in sharing about my power. And those that get over the fear of not doing that well, they seem to be used powerfully of God, and the people begin to come and hear and respond. And so in this story, people begin to hear about the power of God, not because Jesus was there, because we all think, Jesus, if you showed up and you hung out with me at coffee with my friends, I bet all my friends would start following you. But the scripture seems to give us evidence that there are times that Jesus is there and people are like, this makes me real uncomfortable. But seeing you go from death to life, seeing you go from being bound up to being free, seeing you going from being unclean to being pure before the Lord, seeing you go from being uncontainable to being self-contained and self-controlled by the Spirit, seeing you go from being inconsolable to having the comfort of the Spirit, like that happening in you seems to do something for people like, man, only the Lord could have done that. And then I love how Mark writes this, because Jesus would say to him, go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. Now, for a first century reader, that language of the Lord spoke to a level of authority that was either political and cultural or divine. And if you didn't know who Jesus was and you said, hey, and you heard him say, hey, go tell him how much the Lord's done for you, then whatever your conception of God was, you would say, okay, this divine being has done this thing for me. And then Mark writes, just in case you're confused, so he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And so for Mark, he's like, I just want this to be clear for you. This is being done by Jesus, who is the divine Son of God. Like over and over again, he was like, I know the demons got it, but I can't leave the Decapolis. I can't leave the story. I can't leave what's happening in this man without making sure that you get it. That the power of God is resident in the being of Jesus. And Jesus showed up and did works that only God could do because Jesus is God. Like he didn't want that to be mistaken for anybody. That the redemption that's been done wasn't that there's one guy who figured out a better plan than everybody else had figured out. That God himself crossed over this lake, helped this one dude, and went back. That God was present among them. I just want to be honest. Whether it's the man himself, whether it's the townspeople, there's real reason to be afraid. These are they'd be real legitimate fears. I'm just telling you, if I came up here and mid-message, 2,000 pigs came up on the stage with me, and then all of a sudden they went running down the freeway and made their way to the ocean and ran into the ocean, I'd be like, man, I knew Mike was crazy. This text proved it. It would terrify you. And as legitimate and real as those fears may be, they can also rob us of an opportunity to partner with God in his amazing work. It seems like Mark is trying to put right next to each other to compare and contrast the reaction of the townspeople and the reaction of this man. The reaction of the town people is, Jesus, you've done something and I'm uncomfortable with it. I need you to leave. The reaction of this man is, Jesus, you've done something amazing. I need to be with you. They are terrified of what he's accomplished. This guy's like, wherever you go, I'll go. And he trusts Jesus enough to go back and respond to what Jesus is doing and engage all of these people that could have very easily rejected him. So what do we do with that? I said it before, and I'll say it again. Complex challenges require an intensified dependence on the power and the presence of Jesus. So you're probably asking two questions here. One of those questions is, and what does this have to do with the way that we would lean into ministry in our context? So let me answer that one first. Engaging brokenness in our community is as much about faith as it is about action. This story is not a story of a bunch of people who hadn't tried some stuff. It's a story of people who had tried some stuff that was apart from the work of Jesus. And the reality is that even when you think about something as complex as people dealing with addiction, we can be oversimplistic and either make it all physical or make it all something else. And part of what I love about the work that Dan's doing with Harbor Rock is that he's bringing the two things together. He'll tell you, he's like, I feel like I stand in the middle of the clinical world and the church world, and I'm just trying to show them how they need each other. And so there's this action and this faith that need to be commingled together in the way that we do this. And maybe as you hear me talk about this, you're like, I hear you. I don't know that that's my space. That's my world. But man, I pray that even if it's not your personal call, that you're the type of believer that says, but I see what you're doing and I support and believe in what you're doing. And so here's where we get to put our money where our mouth is. What you're going to see on the screen in just a moment is a potential giving scale. When Dan comes off of staff, his monthly budget is going to be $5,500 a month. And so what you're seeing is, what if 250 people said, we believe in the work that God is doing amongst broken people in our community enough that we'll merge faith and action. Maybe there's a person in the room that feels empowered to give $550 a month. I don't need 200 of you, just one. Maybe there's somebody in the room that's like, man, I don't have that kind of financial wherewithal, but I could do $55 a month. What if 20 of us decided that? When I was in Oklahoma and I was a youth leader, there was a young girl in our youth group who wanted to give to missionaries. And she didn't have a job, she didn't make a lot of money, but what she dedicated is that she was not gonna drink Dr. Pepper in the mornings. So kind of like Peter in Acts chapter 2, like it's 9 o'clock, it's too early for me to get some Dr. Pepper, but at 3 o'clock, we getting it on. And she's like, I'm just gonna save the money of what I would spend on buying Dr. Peppers. I'm gonna give that to missions. And she raised this immense amount of money over a year by just saving the 75 cents that she would have spent on a vending machine, Dr. Pepper. Maybe you love Starbucks, and maybe you don't get one every day. I think you probably easily get to $55. What if you gave that money towards the work of what God was doing? Maybe you want to engage your kids in being part of the work of what God's doing, and you want to put faith with action, and you just challenge them. If you could give $5.50 a month to this work, if 250 of us did what this sample chart would build out, we'd give almost $6,200 a month. So here's where I want to challenge you to put faith with action. Because it can be immensely scary to think about brokenness in our community. When I moved here, I lived over in Harbor City for almost 5 years. And when I would tell people where I lived, they'd be like, well, where do you live exactly? I'd be like, oh, my subdivision is across the street from where Mulligan's is or used to be. And if you're not from here, or if you're watching online and you're not from here and you don't know what I'm talking about, just assume. Just follow along on the journey. And when I would say that to people, people would be like, oh. And that was like, in parentheses, we are never coming to your house for dinner. Because it was on that side of the line that made it feel dangerous for people. And not just people who didn't live there, but people in our community. And so when I had my boys, I'd often do walks with them because it would cause them to fall asleep in the afternoon. And I can remember I was walking, I heard two neighbors talking. They're like, man, can you believe that they're about to put a center here in our city for those who are unhoused? Do you know how dangerous that is? Do you know what kind of wreckage it's gonna bring? It's gonna bring our property value down. And like all of their fears started coming out of them. And I'm not even saying their fears weren't legitimate. I'm just saying that their fears were robbing them of an opportunity to be part of what God might wanted to do in our community. And so here's a place where we could put faith in action together. That we can support a work that's happening in our community that's pulling the things together that we would love to see happen in the lives of these people. And if we as a people would commit to being faithful givers towards this, we could see the Lord do immense work through the ministry of Harbor Rock. And so in a moment, you're going to see a QR code on the screen. And I'm actually going to challenge you not to scan it. And here's why. Because in your impulse, you could do the math in your head and be like, here's my budget, here's what I can do. And from your head, you could figure out where you're supposed to be. But that might just be action. But faith would say, what if I slowed down and prayed and asked the Lord what he would want me to do? And so our goal is on October 6th. We're going to come back and we're going to celebrate the number of what God allows us to sacrifice, to give together. And so when you scan that QR code, it goes directly towards giving to Dan. But what I would challenge you to do is put faith with your action, to slow down enough to say, okay, Lord, what would you want of me? Let me not just pick a number that I'm comfortable with. Now let me finish. I think the second question that we have to answer is if this problem is as complex as we think it is and our solutions don't work, then what needs to be true of us that we could be effective in this way? So I wrote it this way. Our courage does not come from the strength of our solutions, but from our time with Jesus. Now, I understand that is a men type thing. Like in churches, you would think that people in church would say, hey, you should spend time with Jesus. But I want to take you a step deeper because Mark chapter 3 is really interesting. Mark chapter 3, I've already mentioned to you, shows you this moment of Jesus dealing with another demon-possessed person. But before that, it gives this picture of Jesus bringing his disciples together. And here's what it says. Verse 12 and 13 give you their names. And then verse 14 says he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, to send them out to preach, and have authority to drive out demons. Now, think about what we just read. You know who you didn't see do anything in the text? The disciples. You know who seems to be operating in this besides Jesus? The guy that was demon-possessed. That his desire was to be with Jesus, and when he gets close to Jesus, Jesus then sends him back to go be a person that proclaims. The story that he gets to tell is, here's how darkness was pushed back through me because I spent time with Jesus. Like, I don't think that we're going to be able to do what we do. I don't think Dan's going to be able to do what he does because we have the best solution and we've got the best curriculum and the best ideas and raised the best budget. It's going to be people who've been on their faces before Jesus and said, I'm spending time with you. Show me where you want to have me. And my prayer is that we would respond courageously to this call. And it may not be to those that are battling addiction. And it may not be in this zip code. But when we spend time with Jesus, it empowers us to do the other two things. And my prayer is that's where our courage would come from. Let me pray. And so, Jesus, I thank you. I'm burdened to believe that you want to deliver us from fear as much as you want to deliver those that are bound by addiction, demonization, sin, and any other level of brokenness. I said it a few weeks ago, but I'll say it again. It is very easy to declare the goodness of Jesus amongst those that already believe it in the safe, sanitized walls of the church, but stepping outside of that context, to be on the front lines of where pain and brokenness might be, that takes courage. And a couple of weeks ago, we asked you to give us the courage just to see it in the community around us. Now will you give us the courage to engage it? Would you give us the courage? What the scriptures would say is that where our treasure is, our heart will be also. Would you give us heart level engagement? And where fear is in the way of that, would you remove it? Lord, I pray, particularly for the person that this is really personal for, whether that's because they themselves have battled or are battling, but they just keep seeing over and over again that you use people like them as ideal disciples to do your work, and it starts with them being with you. Or for the person whose life has been marred, harmed, wounded by someone who struggles in this way. Lord, would you give them a unique mercy? I know it's more complex than what a few minutes of preaching out of a text can solve. But Lord, would you be near them in the same way that you were near the one that you're delivering? Would you give them a level of peace and trust and courage to continue to love and engage even where it might be hard? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.